Good day again to everybody. So as I have promised, I should be giving you some problems to work with today. But before I give those problems to you, I guess I need to give some more examples on the application of rules of replacement and rules of inference. So again, just a quick review. For the rules of inference, we use the rules of inference when we are considering valid arguments. Okay? So basically, as I have mentioned in the last lecture, for the rules of inference, in most cases, you need two premises to work with to come up with an initial conclusion which will now serve as a new premise in the problem, unless you get already the desired conclusion. Except, of course, when we are using the addition and the simplification rule, which only uses one premise. Because in the addition, you have one premise, let's say P, you can make that as P or Q. And then under simplification, when you are given P and Q, that can become P or that can become Q, as the case may be. While for the rules of replacement, you just use one proposition and you can transform it using any of those rules. Kaya nga tinawag na rules of replacement. From a given proposition, you can rewrite it into another form of proposition. Okay? So, let's get moving. The first example for today, we have the first premise is not R. The second premise is not P and Q. The third premise is not R implies P, and our conclusion is not Q. So we have three premises, and then our conclusion is not Q. Now, how do we start? Where do you find Q in your premises? You find Q in the second premise. Okay? So, most likely, our conclusion will use line 2 at the latter part of our proof. But to begin with, let's look at the other premises given. In premise number 1, you have not R. In premise number 3, you also find there not R. And in premise number 3, you have not R implies P. And if you are going to look at premise number 1 and premise number 3, it is actually a replica of modus ponens. Look at your list. In the modus ponens, you have P implies Q as the first premise. The second premise is P. Your conclusion is Q, right? So remember, these are propositions, or if you would like to relate in algebra, these are like variables. Therefore, from our rules of inference, we can change those letters into other letters. Okay? But what is important here is you look at the format. Again, why are we using the modus ponens? We have here not R implies P as the first premise. The second premise is not R. Similar, exactly the same as this first premise here, first proposition here. Therefore, our conclusion there, based from the two lines, will now be P. Again, this is modus ponens of 1 and 3. We obtain P. Okay, but we want Q in our conclusion. So we did not yet use premise number 2. And in premise number 2, what can we do? We have a negation before a group. So we can use there actually De Morgan's rule. And how do we use De Morgan's rule there? It is preceded by a negation. So that now becomes not P, not Q, and then our connective end becomes OR. Okay? And then, so what did we do here? This is just using De Morgan's rule for line number 2. Then after that, we want to have a final conclusion not Q. And not Q is already here. But in premise number 5, you have not P or not Q. This is the disjunction OR. So if you will go over your list for your rules of inference, what can you use? What rule under rules of inference uses your connective OR? Isn't it? It is the disjunctive syllogism. Go to your list, disjunctive syllogism. And in the disjunctive syllogism, it says there, in the original, you have there P or Q, and then the second premise is not P, then the conclusion is Q. Look at this. It's actually a replica. 4 and 5, when you combine them, will be a replica of disjunctive syllogism. Look at this. This is not P or not Q. The other premise is a negation of this one. So what will be the conclusion? It will be this element here. Therefore, our conclusion is not Q. This is now using disjunctive syllogism of line number 5 and line number 4. And after using disjunctive syllogism of line number 4 and 5, we now obtain the desired conclusion. Okay, so I hope our solution there is clear. That's why you really need to be very observant. Again, this will really need a lot of patience in considering the original proposition given. Now, let's look at another example. So let me give you another example here. The first premise now is A implies P. The second premise is A or not C or not E. 3, we have not B. 4, we have D implies C and E, with our conclusion not D. So we have 4 premises and the conclusion is not D. So before you proceed, let's try to scout our premises. And in our premises, you will find D in the fourth premise. Okay? So, the fourth premise is an implication. So, ibig sabihin, so if we'll just imagine, forget first the other premises. If we will just imagine the fourth premise, this is an implication. So if we are desiring to get a not D as a conclusion based from the fourth premise, since this is an implication, we can use modus tollens or modus ponens. But for the modus ponens, the first proposition here must be the second premise so that this will become your conclusion. The then part will become the conclusion. Therefore, modus ponens is not the candidate here. And if you will look at your modus tollens, not D is the negation of this proposition here. Therefore, if we will use our modus tollens, what we need to come up with is the negation of this second proposition. So, along the way, we need not C and E. Okay? We need not C and E. Okay. Let's now go to the first three premises. What can we observe there? What can we write down? Or look at premise number 1 and premise number 3. This is modus tollens. A implies B. We have not B. Therefore, the conclusion there must be not A. Modus tollens using 1 and 3. We obtain not A. So, not A, we have here A or not C or not E. So, this is an or. Not A is a negation of this. We have used this earlier. This is disjunctive syllogism. So, if we will use disjunctive syllogism, we now get, isn't it in the disjunctive syllogism, P or Q? Not P, therefore your conclusion is Q. So, your conclusion here is not C or not E. This is disjunctive syllogism. Disjunctive syllogism of what lines? 2 and 3. 2 and 3. And then, after using disjunctive syllogism of 2 and 3, what can we do here? Remember, earlier we said we want to come up with a not C and E. Look at this. Both are having our negation. So, using De Morgan's rule, this becomes not C and E. De Morgan's rule of line number 6. Then after using De Morgan's rule of line number 6, this is what we have planned to come up with earlier. The negation of this part of line number 4. Since we already have obtained that, if we will use 4 and 7, modus tollens will now tell us that that will become not D. Modus tollens of line number 4 and line number 7. So there you have it, the second example for today. Next, third example. Premise number 1. We have Y and Z implies X. 2, not X or not Z. 3, Y implies Y and Z. Conclusion. Conclusion, Z or not Y. Okay, we have Z or not Y as our conclusion. We find Y and Z in the first, we find Z in the second, we find Y and Z in the third. So, for this one, it's not clear where we can really obtain the conclusion. But, let's try to be observant with our expression. Let's look at our premises again. And Look at number 1 and 3. For premise number 1 and premise number 3, both are implication statements. And look at this, y and z, y and z. Y and z appears as the first proposition in this conditional statement. Y and z comes in the second proposition of this conditional statement. So we can use here hypothetical syllogism. So ano yung sa hypothetical syllogism? P implies Q, Q implies R, therefore P implies R. Right? So this now gives us, this appears in the first, this appears in the second. So hypothetical syllogism. So how will we use that? It should be this way. P implies Q, Q implies R. So that should be the case. Again, P implies Q, Q implies R, therefore P implies R. Or, in this case, it should be Y implies X. This will now be line number 4, using hypothetical syllogism of 1 and 3. Hypothetical syllogism of 1 and 3. So we have obtained y implies x. Next, where do we find here y implies x? X is not in the conclusion. We must get rid of x. We did not yet use premise number 2. This is an and. This is an implication and not x. So if we can just isolate not x, we can use modus tollens with number 4. But how do we isolate x? This is an and. We can use simplification. So from number 2, go now to your simplification rule. Simplification rule states that P and Q, therefore P. O kaya, P and Q, therefore Q. So here we can have not x using simplification of line number 2. And then, after simplifying line number 2, obtaining not x, we can now use line number 5 with line number 4 using modus tollens. And what will that give us? Y implies x, not x. Go to your modus tollens. Modus tollens states that P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P. So our conclusion here will be not Y, using modus tollens of 4 and 5. And next, what do we need? Z or not Y. We already have Y here. Y, but where can you get Z there? You cannot find a single Z in the expression. But if you will go over again your list, you have your rule under addition. And addition rule states that if you are given a proposition, you can add another proposition as long as the connective that you will use is an or. And your conclusion uses the connective or. You already have here the proposition not Y, therefore you can just add Z. Z or not Y. Addition in line number 6. And that's the conclusion already. So there you have it, the third example. Again, guys, it is very helpful that what I'm giving you are video lectures. You know why? You can just go back anytime to the section that you did not understand. Pwede kayo mag-rewind. Pwede nyong ulit-ulitin yung section na yun hanggang maintindihan nyo kung bakit naging ganon. Guys, please always take hold of your rules of replacement and your rules of inference. So every time you find a rule, let's say here, we're using hypothetical syllogism of 1 and 3. Go to your list, hypothetical syllogism, check out. Bakit siya naging hypothetical syllogism? Remember, we are looking at the structure. Diba? Structure yung tinitingnan natin. These are letters, these are variables, these are propositions. We can change them with any letter that we like. What we are looking at are the structures. Okay? One more example. First premise, we have not A or B implies E. Second premise, not A or not B implies not A or B. Third, not A. Fourth, A implies not B. Fifth, E implies S. Conclusion, S. Okay, there you have it. Again, before we proceed, let's first try to plan out our solution. We have 5 premises. Our conclusion is S. Where do you find S based from your premises? It's in premise number 5. That's your S. Okay? And premise number 5 is an implication. It's a conditional statement. Therefore, if you will imagine, we're just imagining, if we will imagine using number 5 to come up with S, what do we need here? We can use, since this is an implication, we can use modus ponens. And if we will use modus ponens, we need a premise that will be E. Because if we have E implies S, E, therefore S. So that's our goal. We need to come up if that's the case. Okay? Initially, that's our case. We're trying to analyze things first. Let's see if that will be the outcome of our solution. But let's go back to our premises and let's see what things can be obtained from our premises. Okay, let's examine. We have several different approaches here. I think we can start off with the simpler premises here. Look at this. This is an implication. This is not A. This is also not A. So, basta implication, ang candidate na tinitingnan natin is either we use modus ponens or we use modus tollens. Pag modus ponens, dapat we get another premise or another premise or another proposition equivalent to the first part of the if-then statement. And it is what we have here. Pag modus tollens, we need to get the negation of this. Okay. But since pareho ito, we can use modus ponens. And that should now give us number 6, which will now be not B. Modus ponens of 3 and 4. Or if you like 4 and 3, it does not matter. Number 7, so we have not B there. Next, what else can we observe? Ang hindi pa natin nagamit is si 1 and 2. Si 1 and 2, si number 5, hindi pa rin natin nagamit. So, anong pwede kaya natin gamit? Let's observe. So, kay 1 and 2, both are conditional statements. And the first expression here is the same as the second expression here. We have used this earlier. It's hypothetical syllogism. HS, hypothetical syllogism. This is, go to your list, hypothetical syllogism, P implies Q, baliktad. P implies Q, Q implies R, therefore P implies R. So this must be not A or not B implies E. We have hypothetical syllogism of 1 and 2. Then after using hypothetical syllogism of 1 and 2, what can we do next? What can we do next? Okay, again, look at the resulting premise. Not A or not B implies E. But we find here E implies S. Another hypothetical syllogism. P implies Q, Q implies R, therefore P implies R. So what do we get? This should now be not A or not B implies S. Using hypothetical syllogism this time of line number 7 and line number 5. Okay, next. What else can we do here? We have, after obtaining that new premise, what else can we do here? So in the resulting premise, we find S, which is the conclusion that we desire. We need then, since this is an implication, to be able to obtain S, we need to come up with this proposition, not A or not B. Not A or not B. But, look at this. In premise number 3, we already have not A. And this is an OR. So, using addition, we get not A or not B. Addition based from line number 3. And since we already have obtained this section of this conditional statement using modus ponens, because this is an implication, first proposition is present here, therefore our conclusion is S. Modus ponens, line number 8 and line number 9, which is what we desire. Okay, so there you have it, the fourth example. So guys, just go back to the examples that I have given. So again, structure is very important. Understand, you are IT students, you are comp-sci students, you don't have to memorize the letters given. What you need is to understand the structure. Very, very important. Understand the structure of every rule that you have, whether it's a rule of replacement or rule of inference. Okay? So again, I hope things are clear. If things are not clear, just go back to the examples that I have given today. Till our next video, so please watch out for my announcements in the Google Classroom. I will be giving a few examples that you can work on your own. Okay? So goodbye. See you in the next lecture.